From waitress to lawyer, a sister's fight for freedom. 14 years. That's how long her brother sat behind bars for a murder he swore he didn't commit. Most people would have given up, moved on. But not her. She was just a waitress, a single mom, with no law degree, and no reason to believe she could win. Yet, night after night, she studied. Day after day, she fought, until one hidden piece of evidence cracked the case wide open. This is the story of a sister's promise, and how far she was willing to go to keep it. The autumn wind cut through Boulder, Colorado like a blade in October 1983, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and something else, something that would haunt the Mitchell family for decades to come. Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching her two young children play in the backyard while a pot of soup simmered on the stove. She was 28 then, with calloused hands from her job at the textile factory, and dreams that seemed as distant as the Rocky Mountains on the horizon. Her younger brother David lived just 3 blocks away in a cramped apartment, working construction when he could find it. He was wild. Everyone said so, with his quick temper and quicker fists. But Sarah knew the gentle soul that lived beneath that rough exterior. When the police cars pulled up outside David's apartment that cold Tuesday morning, Sarah felt something shift in the universe. She watched from her bedroom window as they led her brother away in handcuffs, his dark hair catching the morning light, his eyes searching the street until they found hers. Even from that distance, she could see the confusion written across his face. The charges were unthinkable. Murder in the first degree. Catherine Benson, a local waitress, had been found dead in her apartment 3 days earlier. The evidence seemed overwhelming at first glance. David had been at the bar where Catherine worked that night. Witnesses remembered him being argumentative, and there had been blood on his jacket when police arrested him. Sarah's husband, Tom, tried to prepare her for the worst from the beginning. "You know how David is," he said, sitting across from her at their small kitchen table while their children slept upstairs. "He's been in trouble before. Maybe this time he just went too far." But Sarah shook her head violently, her brown hair whipping around her shoulders. The trial began 6 months later. In the spring of 1984, Sarah took time off from the factory, money they couldn't afford to lose. To sit in that courtroom every single day, she watched the prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man named Reynolds, paint her brother as a violent predator with a history of bar fights and petty crimes. David's court-appointed attorney seemed overwhelmed and underprepared. He was young, fresh out of law school, and clearly intimidated by Reynolds' experience and political connections. Sarah could see it in the way he fumbled through his notes, the way he failed to challenge obvious inconsistencies in witness testimony. The key witness was Maria Santos, a woman who claimed she saw David leaving Catherine's apartment building around midnight. But Sarah noticed what the defense attorney didn't. Maria's story changed slightly each time she told it, small details shifting like sand in the wind. She said David was wearing a red jacket on Tuesday, Sarah whispered to Tom during a lunch break. But yesterday she said it was blue. Tom squeezed her hand gently, but she could see the doubt creeping into his eyes too. The blood evidence was presented with scientific certainty that seemed unshakable in 1984. The prosecutor explained how blood on David's jacket matched Catherine's type, though the more sophisticated DNA testing that would later revolutionize criminal justice was still years away from widespread use. Sarah remembered the moment the verdict was read with crystalline clarity. The foreman, a middle-aged man with kind eyes who had looked sympathetically at David throughout the trial, stood slowly and cleared his throat. "We the jury find the defendant, David Mitchell, guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps and murmurs. Sarah felt her world tilt sideways, as if the earth had shifted beneath her feet. David's face went white, then gray, and he turned to look at her with eyes that held a desperation she had never seen before. The sentencing came 2 weeks later. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Sarah watched her 26-year-old brother led away in shackles, and something fundamental broke inside her chest. Her first visit to Sterling Correctional Facility was 3 weeks after sentencing. The drive took 2 hours through winding mountain roads, past small towns that seemed frozen in time. The prison loomed against the Colorado sky like a concrete monument to human failure. The visiting room was everything Sarah had imagined and worse. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. The smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of too many people living too close together. Metal tables bolted to the floor, plastic chairs that had seen better decades, and guards who watched every interaction with bored but vigilant eyes. David shuffled in wearing orange, his hands shackled to a chain around his waist. Prison had already begun to change him. His shoulders were set differently, his eyes constantly scanning the room for threats. But when he saw Sarah, his face crumpled with relief and desperation. "I didn't do it, Sarah," he said before he even sat down. His voice was hoarse, as if he had been screaming. "I swear on Mom's grave, I didn't kill that woman. You have to believe me." Sarah reached across the metal table and took his shackled hands in hers. They were rougher than she remembered, with new scars across the knuckles. "I know you didn't," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I've known it from the beginning." They talked for the full hour aloud, David explaining the gaps in his memory from that night, the drinking, the argument at the bar that had nothing to do with Catherine Benson. He had been fighting with another man about money owed, nothing more. Catherine had simply been working behind the bar, a witness to his anger, not the target of it. "The lawyer says there's nothing we can do," David said as their time ran short. "Appeals are expensive. And even if we had the money, he says the evidence is too strong. Says I should accept what happened and try to make the best of it." Sarah felt something ignite in her chest, a burning determination that surprised her with its intensity. "No," she said firmly. "I won't accept it. I won't let you rot in here for something you didn't do." David's eyes filled with tears he was trying desperately not to shed in front of the other inmates and guards. "Sarah, you got your own life. Your kids. Tom, you can't fix this. Watch me," Sarah said, and she meant it. The drive home was a blur of mountain scenery and racing thoughts. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Sarah had made a decision that would reshape the next 2 decades of her life. She was going to become a lawyer. Tom laughed when she told him that night, not unkindly, but with the gentle condescension of someone who thought he knew better. "Sarah, honey, you didn't even finish high school, law school. That's not realistic." But Sarah had already begun making plans. She would get her GED, then community college, then a 4-year degree, then law school. It would take years, maybe a decade or more, but David wasn't going anywhere. He would wait because he had to, and she would learn everything she needed to know to set him free. The next morning, she called Boulder Community College and asked about their adult education programs. The woman on the phone was helpful but honest about the challenges ahead. "It's a long road," she said, "especially if you're working and have children. Most people don't finish." "I'm not most people," Sarah replied, and she was already reaching for a pen to write down the enrollment dates. Her first day back in school was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. At 28, she was older than most of her classmates, but younger than the other adult learners who had also come back to chase dreams deferred. She sat in the back of her basic mathematics class, a composition notebook open in front of her, and listened to concepts she should have learned 15 years earlier. The work was harder than she had expected. Algebra felt like a foreign language, and essay writing revealed gaps in her education that seemed impossible to bridge. But every time she wanted to quit, she thought of David in his orange jumpsuit, counting days in a cell, waiting for her to become someone who could help him. She developed a routine that became as natural as breathing. Work at the textile factory from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. Pick up the children from school. Help with homework while dinner cooked. Then her own studying after they went to bed. Tom grew increasingly distant as the months passed, complaining that she had no time for him anymore, that she was obsessing over something she couldn't change. David made his choices, Tom said one night as Sarah bent over her chemistry textbook at the kitchen table. He got in fights. He drank too much. He hung around with the wrong people. Maybe he didn't kill that woman, but he put himself in the position where something like this could happen. Sarah looked up from her book, seeing her husband clearly for perhaps the first time in years. That's not how justice works. Tom, you don't get convicted because you might have done something. You get convicted because you did do something. And David didn't do this. The first time she got an A on a college exam, Sarah drove straight to the prison to tell David. His face lit up with pride and hope in a way that made the fluorescent lights seem less harsh, the concrete walls less permanent. "You really think you can do this?" he asked. And she heard the vulnerability in his voice. Prison was wearing him down. Day by day, year by year, she could see it in the way he held his shoulders, the new lines around his eyes. "I know I can do this," Sarah said. "The question is whether you can wait long enough for me to get there." David smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since before his arrest. "I got nothing but time." "Sis, nothing but time." But time, Sarah was learning, was the one thing none of them could afford to waste. Every day David spent in prison was a day stolen from his life, and every day she spent in classrooms was a day her own family grew more distant. The balance was delicate and cruel, but she had made her choice. She would become a lawyer, even if it destroyed everything else in her life, because some promises, once made, could never be broken. Part 2, the education journey. The rejection letter from the University of Colorado arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 1987, 3 years after Sarah had started her journey back to school. She stared at the thin envelope in her mailbox, knowing before she opened it what it contained. "We regret to inform you that we are unable to offer you admission to the University of Colorado at Boulder for the fall semester." Sarah sat in her car in the driveway, reading the letter twice before the tears came. 3 years of perfect attendance at Boulder Community College. 3 years of studying until her eyes burned. 3 years of sacrificing time with her children and husband, and it still wasn't enough. Tom found her there 20 minutes later when he came home from his shift at the auto parts store. He knocked on the passenger window gently, his face already understanding what had happened. "Come inside, Sarah," he said through the glass. "We'll figure something out." but inside their small kitchen. As Sarah heated up leftover casserole for dinner while their children did homework at the table, Tom's patience finally cracked. Maybe this is a sign, he said quietly. So the kids wouldn't hear, maybe it's time to accept that some things just aren't meant to be. Sarah turned from the stove, wooden spoon still in her hand, and looked at the man she had married 12 years earlier. He was still handsome, still kind in his way, but she could see the resentment that had been building like sediment in a riverbed. David is sitting in a cell for a crime he didn't commit, she said. What exactly am I supposed to accept about that? You're supposed to accept that you can't save everyone, Tom replied, his voice rising despite his attempt to keep it low. You're supposed to accept that your family here, right now, needs you more than David does. 8-year-old Emma looked up from her homework, sensing the tension. Mom, are you and Dad fighting about Uncle David again? Sarah forced a smile and ruffled her daughter's hair. No, sweetheart. Dad and I are just talking about grown-up things. How's that math homework coming along? But later that night, after the children were asleep, the conversation continued in harsh whispers in their bedroom. Tom sat on the edge of their bed, still in his work clothes, looking older than his 32 years. I can't do this anymore. Sarah, I feel like I'm married to a ghost. You're here, but you're not really here. Sarah understood what he meant, even if she couldn't change it. Every conversation, every family dinner, every quiet moment was filtered through her awareness of David's absence. While her children grew and learned and discovered the world, David counted days in a concrete box. While she and Tom should have been building their marriage, she was building a future that had room for only one mission. I got accepted to Colorado State, she said quietly. Full scholarship based on my community college grades. Tom's head snapped up. Fort Collins. That's 2 hours away. I can commute, leave early, come back late. It's only for 2 years. Sarah, listen to yourself. You're talking about spending 4 hours a day in the car, on top of a full course load, on top of working, on top of trying to be a mother. It's impossible. But Sarah had already worked out the logistics in her mind. She would quit the textile factory and find part-time work that offered more flexibility. She would study in the car during breaks, use every spare moment. She would make it work because the alternative was unthinkable. Her first day at Colorado State University in Fort Collins felt like stepping into another world. The campus sprawled across green lawns and modern buildings, filled with young people who seemed to belong there in a way Sarah knew she never would. At 31, she was older than some of her professors. The academic work was significantly more challenging than community college. Her introduction to philosophy class made her head spin with concepts that seemed deliberately obscure. Organic chemistry felt like learning to speak in mathematical poetry. But it was her political science courses that truly ignited something in Sarah's mind. Professor Margaret Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had worked as a public defender before entering academia, became Sarah's unofficial mentor. After class one day, she asked Sarah to stay behind. You write about criminal justice with unusual passion, Professor Chen observed. Shuffling through Sarah's latest essay, most students approach these topics academically. You write like someone who has personal stakes involved. Sarah considered how much to reveal. My brother was wrongfully convicted. I'm hoping to help him someday. Professor Chen nodded slowly. Law school. That's the plan. It's a difficult path. Expensive. Time-consuming. And the legal system doesn't like being challenged, especially on old cases. Professor Chen leaned back in her chair. But sometimes difficult paths are the only ones worth taking. The commute to Fort Collins became Sarah's thinking time. 4 hours a day in her aging Honda Civic, listening to recorded lectures and reviewing notes at red lights. She learned to eat meals with one hand while driving, to change clothes in gas station bathrooms, to exist on 4 hours of sleep and caffeine. Tom's resentment deepened as the months passed. He had taken on more responsibility with the children, helping with homework and bedtime routines that had always been Sarah's domain. But instead of growing closer to Emma and 6-year-old Jake, he seemed to withdraw further into himself. I married a wife and mother, he said one evening as Sarah packed her books for the next day's classes, not a crusader. Sarah paused in her packing. You married me. This is who I am. No, this is who you've become. The woman I married cared about her family more than some impossible dream. The fight that followed was their worst yet, voices raised despite the children sleeping upstairs. Tom accused Sarah of using David's situation as an excuse to abandon her responsibilities as a wife and mother. Sarah accused Tom of wanting her to give up on her brother to make his own life more convenient. Maybe we need some time apart, Tom said finally, the words hanging in the kitchen like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for years. Sarah felt something break inside her chest, but also something like relief. Maybe we do. Tom moved out 2 weeks later, taking a small apartment across town. The custody arrangement was informal at first. The children would stay with Sarah during the week and spend weekends with their father. It was practical and civilized and completely heartbreaking. Emma, now 10, tried to pretend everything was normal. throwing herself into schoolwork and piano lessons with desperate enthusiasm. Jake, only 8, asked questions Sarah couldn't answer. Why can't Dad live here anymore? When is he coming back? Did I do something wrong? Sometimes grown-ups need space to figure things out, Sarah would say, the same inadequate explanation she gave each time. But at night, after the children were asleep, she would sit at her kitchen table surrounded by textbooks and wonder if Tom was right. Wonder if she was destroying her family to save her brother. The answer came during her monthly visit to see David. He had been in prison for 4 years now, and the changes in him were becoming more pronounced. His hair was graying at the temples, though he was only 30. His hands had developed a slight tremor that came from constant vigilance, never fully relaxing. Tom left. Sarah told him during their visit that month. David's face crumpled with guilt. Sarah, no, you can't sacrifice your marriage for me. I won't let you do that. It's not about you, Sarah said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. It's about me becoming someone I can live with. I can't be the person who gives up on you. But your kids, my kids are going to grow up knowing that family doesn't abandon family, that sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, but you do it anyway. Sarah reached across the metal table and took David's hands. They're going to be proud of their mother someday. David was quiet for a long moment, staring down at their joined hands. I dream about the night Katherine Benson died, he said finally. I dream about what really happened while I was passed out drunk in my apartment. Someone killed her while I was unconscious, and they're walking free while I'm in here. Then we're going to find them, Sarah said with a certainty that surprised her. Someday, when I know enough, when I have the right tools, we're going to find out what really happened. Her junior year at Colorado State was when Sarah truly hit her stride academically. Her grades were excellent. Her professors recommended her for honor societies, and she began to allow herself to believe that law school might actually be possible. She applied to 6 schools: University of Colorado, University of Denver, Colorado State's own law program, and 3 schools in neighboring states. The acceptance letter from University of Denver arrived on a Thursday in April 1991. Sarah opened it in her car after picking up the mail, and she actually screamed with joy so loudly that Mrs. Patterson from next door came out to make sure she was okay. I got in, Sarah told David during their next visit, unable to contain her excitement. Law school. It's really happening. David's smile was the brightest she had seen in years. I knew you would. I always knew you were the smart one in the family. But the practical realities of law school loomed large. Even with financial aid, the cost was staggering. Sarah would need to take out loans that would take decades to repay. She would need to quit any regular employment, survive on savings and borrowed money for 3 years while barely seeing her children. Tom, who had started dating a woman from his work, was surprisingly supportive when Sarah told him about her acceptance. The kids can stay with me more often, he offered. You'll need to focus on your studies. It was a generous offer, but it meant acknowledging that her children would essentially be raised by their father and his new girlfriend, while Sarah chased her degree. The guilt felt like a physical weight, but she had come too far to turn back. Her first day of law school at the University of Denver was both terrifying and exhilarating. At 35, Sarah was among the older students, but not the oldest. The work was intense from the first week, with reading assignments that took hours to complete, and concepts that required complete rewiring of how she thought about justice and law. Constitutional law became her favorite class, taught by Professor James Morrison, a former Supreme Court clerk who demanded excellence and somehow made even the driest legal precedents feel alive and vital. Contracts law was torture, an endless maze of technicalities and exceptions. Criminal law was where Sarah felt most at home. Though she was careful not to reveal her personal interest in the subject, study groups formed naturally, usually among students who lived in the same apartment complex or had similar backgrounds. Sarah found herself studying alone most of the time, driving back to Boulder after classes to spend a few hours with her children before diving into case books that weighed as much as phone books. Emma, now 13, had grown resentful of her mother's absences. Why can't you just be normal? She demanded one evening when Sarah missed her school play for the 2nd time that semester. Why can't you just have a regular job like other moms? Sarah knelt down to her daughter's level, seeing Tom's eyes staring back at her. Because sometimes being normal isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be extraordinary to fix what's broken. I don't care about Uncle David, Emma said, the words cutting deeper than any academic failure could have. I care about you being my mom. That night, Sarah sat in her car in the law school parking lot and cried until her eyes were swollen. She called her sister Linda, who lived in California and had been watching Sarah's journey with a mixture of admiration and concern. Maybe Emma's right, Sarah admitted into the phone. Maybe I'm being selfish, putting my need to save David ahead of my children's need for their mother. Linda was quiet for a moment. Do you remember when we were kids? And Dad used to tell us that Mitchell women were stronger than other people, that we could handle things other people couldn't. Yeah, he was right about you, Sarah. You're handling something that would have broken most people years ago. Your kids will understand that someday. And if they don't, then you'll deal with that too, because that's who you are. Sarah's second year of law school was when she first learned about the Innocence Project, a legal organization dedicated to exonerating wrongfully convicted individuals through DNA testing. The concept was revolutionary and exactly what Sarah had been unconsciously working toward for 8 years. She wrote her constitutional law paper on wrongful convictions and the evolution of DNA evidence in criminal cases. Professor Morrison returned it with an A+ and a note. Have you considered specializing in criminal defense? You have a natural understanding of the human cost of legal failures. By her third year, Sarah was working part-time at a legal aid clinic, representing clients who couldn't afford private attorneys. The work was emotionally draining, but intellectually satisfying in a way she had never experienced. She was finally becoming someone who could help people navigate the system that had failed David so completely. The bar exam loomed like a final mountain to climb. Sarah studied 16 hours a day for 2 months, surviving on coffee and determination. The exam itself was 3 days of legal torture, testing everything she had learned in law school and some things she was sure she hadn't. When the results were posted 6 weeks later, Sarah drove to the state bar website at the public library, too nervous to check from home. Her name was on the list, Sarah Mitchell, Esquire. After 8 years, countless sacrifices, and more than $50,000 in student loans, she was finally a lawyer. David cried when she told him, actual tears streaming down his face in the visiting room at Sterling Correctional Facility. You did it, he whispered. You actually did it. We did it, Sarah corrected. Now the real work begins. Part 3, the investigation. Sarah's first office was a converted storage room in the back of a legal aid clinic in downtown Boulder, with no windows and a radiator that clanged like a prisoner rattling chains. She had hung her law degree on the wall next to a picture of David taken before his arrest, when he still smiled easily and his eyes held no shadows. The contrast between those two items told the story of the last decade of her life. Her caseload at the clinic was overwhelming. Domestic violence cases, immigration issues, landlord disputes, and minor criminal defense work. Each client deserved her full attention. But Sarah found her mind constantly drifting to the boxes of David's case files she had stored in her apartment. Every night after work, she would spread those files across her kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting 11 years to be solved. The original police report was a masterpiece of lazy investigation. Detective Raymond Walsh had taken witness statements that supported his theory and ignored those that didn't. The crime scene had been processed hastily, with several potential pieces of evidence dismissed as irrelevant. Most troubling of all, the investigation had essentially stopped the moment David was arrested. Sarah began by creating a timeline of that October night in 1983. Catherine Benson had finished her shift at Murphy's Tavern at 11:30 p.m. Multiple witnesses confirmed she had seemed normal, even cheerful, counting her tips and joking with the kitchen staff. David had left the bar around 11:00 p.m. after his altercation with Jerry Martinez over a $50 debt. This much was undisputed. But the gap between 11:30 p.m. and 3:00 a.m., when Catherine's body was discovered by her neighbor, had never been properly investigated. The assumption had been that David returned to Catherine's apartment building, somehow gained entry, and killed her during a robbery attempt. But no one had ever explained how David, who was falling down drunk according to multiple witnesses, had managed to climb 3 flights of stairs and overpower a healthy 24-year-old woman. Sarah's first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. She had placed a small advertisement in the Boulder Daily Camera asking anyone with information about Catherine Benson's murder to contact her. Most of the responses were from cranks and conspiracy theorists. But one call stood out. I worked the late shift at the 7-Eleven on Canyon Boulevard, said the gravelly voice of Roger Henley, now retired. I remember that night because of all the police cars, but I also remember seeing someone I recognized walking past the store around midnight. Someone who wasn't your brother. They met at a coffee shop near the university. Roger was in his 70s now, with arthritis gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee mug. But his memory of that night was crystalline. I knew Catherine because she'd come in sometimes to buy cigarettes after her shift, he explained. Sweet girl, always polite. That night, maybe 20 minutes after midnight, I saw Marcus Coleman walking past the store, heading toward her apartment complex. Sarah's pulse quickened. Marcus Coleman was a name from the original case files, a man who had been questioned briefly and released. Did you tell the police about seeing him? Roger's expression darkened. I tried to call the station the next day, told them what I'd seen. Detective Walsh said they'd already cleared Marcus, said they had their man and didn't need any more witnesses. Sarah drove straight from the coffee shop to the Boulder County Records Office. Marcus Coleman had a criminal history dating back to the 1970s. Assault, burglary, and sexual assault charges. In 1982, just a year before Catherine's murder, he had been arrested for attacking a female bartender in Denver. The charges had been dropped when the victim moved out of state. More disturbing still, Marcus had died in a car accident in 1987, 4 years after David's conviction. Dead men tell no tales, and they can't be prosecuted for murders they may have committed. Sarah's investigation into the original evidence proved even more revealing. The blood on David's jacket, which had seemed so damning in 1984, had never been properly tested beyond basic blood typing. DNA analysis, which was becoming standard by the early 1990s, could have definitively proven whether the blood belonged to Catherine Benson or someone else entirely. But when Sarah requested the original evidence from the Boulder Police Department, she encountered her first major obstacle. Evidence clerk Janet Morrison, a thin woman with suspicious eyes, informed Sarah that many items from cases older than 10 years had been destroyed to make room in the evidence warehouse. The blood evidence from your brother's case. Janet checked her computer system with exaggerated care. Disposed of in 1991. Standard procedure. Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Without the physical evidence, proving David's innocence would be nearly impossible. But something in Janet's manner suggested she wasn't telling the complete truth. That evening, Sarah called her old professor, Margaret Chen, who had maintained contacts in law enforcement throughout her academic career. Janet Morrison has a reputation, Professor Chen told her. Word is she's been known to make evidence disappear for the right price, usually for defense attorneys who want to avoid awkward questions about their clients. The implication was clear. Someone had paid Janet Morrison to destroy the evidence in David's case, but who and why? Sarah's answer came from an unexpected source. Tom, despite their divorce 2 years earlier, still worried about her obsession with David's case. During one of their awkward conversations about their children's school schedules, he mentioned something that made Sarah's blood run cold. You know, Detective Walsh retired to Florida last year, he said casually. Bought himself a nice house on the beach. Pretty expensive for a cop's pension. Sarah spent the next week researching Raymond Walsh's financial history through public records. What she found was a pattern of suspicious wealth accumulation beginning in the mid-1980s, real estate investments, expensive cars, and a lifestyle that far exceeded what a Boulder police detective should have been able to afford. The pieces began forming a picture that made Sarah sick to her stomach. Walsh had been taking bribes to manipulate investigations. Catherine Benson's murder had been solved too quickly and too conveniently. With David serving as the perfect scapegoat, Walsh had protected the real killer, possibly Marcus Coleman, in exchange for money. And when DNA testing began threatening old convictions, Walsh had arranged for the evidence to disappear, but proving this theory required more than circumstantial evidence. Sarah needed documentation, witnesses, something concrete that could overturn David's conviction in court. Her breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Cleaning out her mother's house after the old woman's death, Sarah's sister Linda found a box of old letters and documents that their mother had saved. Among them was a letter David had written from prison in 1985, 2 years after his conviction. There's something I never told you about that night. David had written in his careful handwriting, I was so drunk I could barely walk, but I remember someone helping me get home, a woman with dark hair who said she knew Catherine. She walked me to my apartment and made sure I got inside. I never told the police because I couldn't remember her name, and I was afraid they wouldn't believe me. Sarah stared at the letter for a long time, realizing its significance. If David had been helped home by a witness, that person could provide an alibi for the crucial time period when Catherine was murdered. But who was this mysterious woman? And how could Sarah find her 14 years later? The answer came from Catherine Benson's personnel file at Murphy's Tavern, which Sarah obtained through a private investigator she had hired with money she couldn't afford to spend. Catherine had listed an emergency contact, her roommate, Patricia Valdez. Patricia had moved to Denver after Catherine's death, traumatized by losing her friend and frightened by the random violence that had suddenly invaded her life. When Sarah finally tracked her down through phone records and utility bills, she found a woman in her late 30s who had spent 14 years trying to forget the worst night of her life. They met at Patricia's small apartment in a working-class Denver neighborhood. Patricia was nervous, chain-smoking cigarettes and jumping at every sound from the street. But when Sarah explained who she was and why she had come, Patricia's demeanor changed completely. I always knew they got the wrong man, she said without hesitation. Katie talked about David Mitchell sometimes, said he seemed lonely and sad, but harmless. She felt sorry for him. Did you see David that night? Patricia nodded slowly. I was walking home from my boyfriend's place around midnight when I saw this guy stumbling down the street, barely able to stand up. He was mumbling something about Catherine, so I helped him get home, made sure he was safe. Sarah's heart was pounding. You're sure it was David? Positive. I'd seen him at the bar before. He was completely wasted, couldn't have hurt anyone even if he'd wanted to. Patricia stubbed out her cigarette with shaking fingers. I called the police the next morning when I heard about Katie, told them what I'd seen. They said they'd look into it. Detective Walsh. Yeah, that was his name. He came to my apartment a few days later, asked me a bunch of questions. Then he told me I was mistaken about the time. that it must have been earlier in the evening. When I insisted I knew what time it was, he got angry, said if I kept telling lies, I could be charged with obstruction of justice. Sarah felt a familiar rage building in her chest. So you stayed quiet. I was 23 years old and scared out of my mind. My best friend was dead, and this cop was threatening me. So yeah, I stayed quiet. But I've regretted it every day since. Patricia agreed to provide a sworn affidavit detailing what she had witnessed that night. It wasn't enough to free David by itself, but it was a crucial piece of evidence that had been suppressed by Walsh's corruption. Sarah's investigation had now uncovered a pattern of police misconduct, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation, but she still needed physical evidence to prove David's innocence conclusively. DNA testing had advanced significantly since 1983, and even small traces of biological material could now be analyzed with startling accuracy. The question was whether any physical evidence from Katherine Benson's murder still existed. Despite Janet Morrison's claims to the contrary, Sarah's answer came from an unexpected ally. Janet Morrison's replacement as evidence clerk was a young man named Timothy Ross, who took his job seriously and had been disturbed by some of the gaps he'd discovered in the evidence logs. There are boxes in the basement that don't match the computer records, he told Sarah during a clandestine meeting at a restaurant outside Boulder. Stuff that was supposed to be destroyed but somehow never was. I think Janet was running some kind of side business, keeping evidence that certain people wanted to disappear. Timothy agreed to help Sarah search for any remaining evidence from David's case, but it would have to be done carefully and unofficially. If they were caught, Timothy would lose his job and Sarah could face criminal charges for evidence tampering. They met at the evidence warehouse on a Saturday evening when the building was supposedly empty. Timothy led Sarah through corridors lined with metal shelving units that stretched toward the ceiling, like the stacks of some nightmare library. Each box represented someone's tragedy, someone's moment when their life intersected with violence or crime. They found Katherine Benson's evidence box in the basement, misfiled under a different case number and covered with dust that suggested it hadn't been moved in years. Inside were items that should have been destroyed years earlier. Katherine's clothing from that night, fingernail scrapings that might contain her attacker's DNA, and most importantly, a blood sample that had never been properly tested. Sarah stared at the vial of dried blood, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. After 14 years, she finally had the evidence that could prove David's innocence. We need to get this to a private lab for DNA testing, she told Timothy. Can you arrange for it to be officially checked out? Timothy nodded nervously. I can make it look like routine evidence review for an appeal, but if anyone asks questions, they won't, Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. And if they do, I'll handle it. The DNA testing took 6 weeks and cost $3,000 that Sarah had to borrow against her credit cards. She had warned David that she was close to a breakthrough, but she hadn't dared to raise his hopes too high. 14 years of disappointments had taught them both to be cautious about good news. When the results finally came back, Sarah was sitting in her office late on a Thursday evening, the only light coming from her desk lamp and the glow of the computer screen. She opened the email attachment with trembling fingers. The blood on David's jacket was not Katherine Benson's. It wasn't even human blood. According to the lab report, it was deer blood, consistent with David's story that he had helped a friend butcher a deer several days before the murder. More importantly, the fingernail scrapings from Katherine's body contained DNA from her attacker. The profile didn't match David, but it did match a sample in the Colorado criminal database. Marcus Coleman, the man who had died in 1987 while David sat in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Sarah printed out the lab report with shaking hands, then sat back in her chair and cried. 14 years of her life, her marriage, her relationship with her children, thousands of hours of study and investigation, all leading to this moment. David was innocent, and she could finally prove it. But even with DNA evidence, overturning a 14-year-old conviction wouldn't be simple. The legal system was designed to resist such challenges, and there were powerful people who had reasons to keep David's case closed. Detective Walsh might be retired, but his reputation and pension were still at stake. The prosecutors who had built their careers on convictions like David's wouldn't welcome evidence that they had been wrong. Sarah knew the hardest part of her journey was just beginning. She had the evidence to prove David's innocence, but now she had to convince a system that had already failed him once to admit its mistakes and set him free. As she sat in her small office, surrounded by law books and case files, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had kept her promise to David, even if it had cost her everything else. Tomorrow, she would begin the fight to bring him home. Part 4. Justice and Freedom. The Boulder County District Attorney's Office occupied a modern glass building that gleamed in the Colorado sunshine like a monument to justice. Sarah had walked past it countless times during law school, never imagining she would one day sit across from the DA himself, armed with evidence that could shatter one of his predecessor's most celebrated convictions. District Attorney Michael Brennan was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of confident bearing that came from winning most of the battles you chose to fight. His office walls displayed commendations and photographs with politicians, the careful stagecraft of someone with higher ambitions than local prosecution. "Miss Mitchell," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his massive desk. "I understand you have some concerns about the David Mitchell conviction from 1983. Sarah placed the DNA lab reports and Patricia Valdez's affidavit on his desk with deliberate precision. "I have proof that my brother is innocent of Catherine Benson's murder, DNA evidence that wasn't available at the time of his trial." Brennan's expression didn't change as he read through the documents, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he understood the implications. This wasn't just about freeing one wrongfully convicted man. This was about exposing a pattern of corruption that could destroy careers and trigger dozens of other appeals. "These are serious allegations," he said finally. "Police misconduct, evidence tampering, prosecutorial negligence. You understand that even if this DNA evidence is valid, it doesn't automatically overturn your brother's conviction." Sarah had expected this response. The legal system protected itself first. Justice second. "The DNA proves that Marcus Coleman killed Catherine Benson while my brother was passed out drunk in his apartment. We have a witness who can verify David's whereabouts during the time of the murder. What more proof do you need? I need to be certain that this evidence was obtained legally and that the chain of custody hasn't been compromised." Brennan leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with the calculating gaze of a poker player. "I also need to consider the broader implications of reopening a case this old." The subtext was clear. Admitting that David had been wrongfully convicted would open the door to lawsuits, investigations, and uncomfortable questions about how many other innocent people might be sitting in Colorado prisons. It would be much easier to find procedural reasons to dismiss Sarah's evidence and maintain the status quo, but Sarah had spent 14 years preparing for this moment. She understood the system's weaknesses as well as its strengths, and she had one advantage that Brennan couldn't match. She had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, "my brother has spent 14 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. I've spent 14 years of my life proving his innocence. I will file appeals. I will go to the media. I will make this case a public embarrassment for your office until you do the right thing. The only question is whether you want to be remembered as the DA who fought to keep an innocent man in prison, or the one who had the courage to admit when the system got it wrong." Brennan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the polished surface of his desk. Finally, he spoke. "I'll need to have our lab verify your DNA results. If they're confirmed, and if the evidence was obtained properly, I'll consider recommending that the conviction be overturned." It wasn't the immediate vindication Sarah had hoped for, but it was more than she had dared to expect. "How long will that take?" 60 days, maybe 90 if there are complications. Sarah nodded, understanding that this was likely the best she could do through official channels, but she had learned not to rely entirely on the goodwill of prosecutors and judges. That afternoon, she called Channel 7 News and arranged an interview for the following week. The news segment aired on a Tuesday evening, just as Boulder families were sitting down to dinner. Sarah had practiced her talking points carefully, focusing on the DNA evidence and Patricia Valdez's testimony while avoiding direct accusations against specific individuals who were still alive and could sue for defamation. 14 years ago, my brother David Mitchell was convicted of a murder he didn't commit, she told the camera, sitting in the same visiting room where she had promised David she would save him. New DNA evidence proves that the real killer was Marcus Coleman, a man with a history of violence against women who died in 1987 while David sat in prison. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah's phone rang constantly with calls from other defense attorneys, journalists, and family members of convicted individuals who wondered if their cases might also involve police misconduct. The Colorado Innocence Project offered their assistance, bringing resources and expertise that Sarah couldn't have marshaled on her own. More importantly, the publicity put pressure on District Attorney Brennan to act quickly and transparently. When politicians and editorial boards began calling for justice in the David Mitchell case, bureaucratic delays became politically impossible. The DNA verification took 6 weeks instead of the promised 60 to 90 days. When the results came back, confirming Sarah's lab findings, Brennan called a press conference to announce that his office would not oppose David's appeal for exoneration. The evidence presented by Mitchell raises serious questions about Mr. Mitchell's conviction, Brennan told the assembled reporters. While we cannot undo the injustice that has been done, we can ensure that it is corrected as quickly as possible. The legal proceedings that followed were remarkably swift by the standards of the appeals process. Judge Maria Santos, who had been a young prosecutor when David was first convicted, seemed genuinely horrified by the evidence of police misconduct and witness intimidation. During the hearing, she questioned the state's attorneys aggressively about how such obvious evidence could have been ignored for so long. "This case represents a fundamental failure of our justice system at multiple levels," Judge Santos said from the bench. "A man has spent 14 years in prison for a crime that basic police work should have proven he couldn't have committed. The court finds that David Mitchell's conviction was obtained through police misconduct and prosecutorial negligence that denied him his constitutional right to a fair trial." Sarah was sitting in the gallery when Judge Santos delivered her ruling, Patricia Valdez beside her, and Timothy Ross a few rows back. When the judge announced that David's conviction was being overturned and that he would be released immediately, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 14 years. Complete and total relief. The drive to Sterling Correctional Facility took 3 hours, but Sarah barely noticed the mountain scenery that had become so familiar over the years. David was being processed for release, a bureaucratic procedure that seemed to take forever when freedom was finally within reach. When David walked out of the prison gates, he looked smaller than Sarah remembered, as if the years had compressed him somehow. But when he saw her standing beside her car, his face broke into the same smile she remembered from their childhood, before the world had taught them both how cruel it could be. They held each other in the parking lot of Sterling Correctional Facility, neither of them speaking for several minutes. 14 years of visits through reinforced glass, of conversations monitored by guards, of hope deferred and dreams delayed, all condensed into one moment of pure human connection. "I knew you'd do it," David whispered against her shoulder. "I always knew you'd find a way." But freedom, Sarah quickly learned, was more complicated than either of them had anticipated. David had entered prison as a 26-year-old man with basic job skills and a life he understood. He emerged as a 40-year-old with institutionalized reflexes and no idea how to navigate a world that had moved on without him. The cell phone in Sarah's purse might as well have been alien technology. The internet was a mysterious force that seemed to control everything from job applications to basic communication. Even simple tasks like grocery shopping overwhelmed him, with choices that hadn't existed when he went away. Sarah had prepared a small apartment for David in Boulder, close enough that she could help him adjust but far enough from the prison that he wouldn't be constantly reminded of where he had been. The first night, she found him sleeping on the floor beside the bed, unable to adjust to the softness of a real mattress after 14 years on a prison cot. "The space feels too big," he explained the next morning, embarrassed by his inability to adapt. "In prison, you always know exactly where the walls are. Here, I keep thinking someone could come up behind me." The nightmares were worse. David would wake up screaming, convinced he was back in his cell, that Sarah's visits and the DNA evidence and Judge Santos's ruling had all been an elaborate dream designed to torture him with hope. Sarah would find him sitting at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, just staring at his hands, trying to convince himself that he was really free. The media attention that had helped secure David's release now became a burden. Reporters camped outside his apartment, shouting questions about his plans for the future and whether he intended to sue the state. Well-meaning strangers recognized him on the street and wanted to share their outrage about his case, not understanding that David just wanted to buy groceries without being reminded of the 14 years that had been stolen from him. Sarah tried to shield him from the worst of it, but she was dealing with her own adjustment challenges. The single-minded focus that had sustained her through law school and the investigation had left little room for other aspects of her life. Now that David was free, she had to confront what that obsession had cost her. Emma, now 24 and working as a teacher in Denver, came to Boulder for a tense family dinner 2 weeks after David's release. She was polite to her uncle, genuinely happy that he had been freed, but her relationship with Sarah remained strained. "I'm proud of what you did, Mom," Emma said as they stood in Sarah's kitchen after David had gone to bed. "But I also spent my teenage years essentially motherless. Because you were so focused on saving him. I needed you too. And you weren't there." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had known this conversation was coming, had dreaded it even as she fought for David's freedom. "I know I wasn't the mother you needed. I'm sorry for that. But I couldn't live with myself if I had given up on him. I understand that now," Emma said, her voice softer. "I didn't when I was 15 and needed help with algebra, or when I was 17 and had my heart broken for the first time. But I understand why you made the choices you did." Jake, now 22 and finishing college, was more forgiving, perhaps because he had been younger when Tom moved out and had fewer clear memories of what their family had been like before David's case consumed everything. He came to visit David regularly, bringing video games and movies, trying to help his uncle catch up on 14 years of popular culture. "Uncle David, you missed the entire Star Wars prequel trilogy," Jake announced one evening, as if this was the greatest tragedy of David's incarceration. David smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him since his release. From what I hear, that might have been a blessing. Tom, now remarried with a toddler daughter, was surprisingly supportive during David's transition. The anger and resentment that had ended their marriage seemed to have faded with time and distance, replaced by a grudging respect for what Sarah had accomplished. "I was wrong about a lot of things," he told Sarah during one of their awkward conversations about coordinating family visits. "I thought you were destroying our family for an impossible dream. I didn't understand that you were trying to save what was left of it." The civil lawsuit against the state of Colorado moved forward slowly, handled by a team of attorneys who specialized in wrongful conviction cases. The potential settlement was substantial. Millions of dollars that could never truly compensate for 14 lost years, but might provide David with financial security for the rest of his life. But the legal process was re-traumatizing in its own way. David was required to give detailed depositions about his treatment in prison, forced to relive the worst moments of his incarceration for the benefit of court reporters and opposing counsel. Sarah watched him grow thinner and more withdrawn as the depositions continued. The price of justice measured in psychological pain. The investigation into Detective Walsh's corruption expanded beyond David's case. Timothy Ross, the evidence clerk who had helped Sarah find the hidden evidence, came forward officially, revealing the extent of Janet Morrison's evidence tampering operation. Federal investigators discovered a pattern of misconduct stretching back years, involving dozens of cases and hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes. Walsh, enjoying his retirement in Florida, was arrested on federal corruption charges. At 72, facing the possibility of dying in prison, he agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His confession revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed David's life. Marcus Coleman had been paying Walsh protection money since the early 1980s, buying immunity for a series of violent crimes against women. When Katherine Benson fought back during Coleman's attack, killing her wasn't part of the plan. But Walsh was too deeply in Coleman's pocket to do anything but cover it up. David, drunk and belligerent and in the wrong place at the wrong time, made the perfect scapegoat. "I convinced myself I was just taking money from scumbags who deserved whatever they got," Walsh said during his confession, recorded and later played at his sentencing hearing. "But Katherine Benson didn't deserve to die, and David Mitchell didn't deserve to go to prison. I've been carrying that guilt for 20 years. The confession provided closure of a sort, but it couldn't give David back the years he had lost or restore Sarah's relationship with her children to what it might have been. Justice, Sarah realized, was not a destination but a process, messy and incomplete and never quite sufficient to balance the scales of human suffering. 6 months after his release, David found work at a small construction company owned by a man who had followed his case in the news and believed in second chances. The physical labor was familiar and comforting, requiring the kind of focus that kept his mind from wandering to darker places. His coworkers, initially curious about his story, gradually accepted him as just another guy trying to make an honest living. Sarah continued practicing law, now specializing in criminal defense and wrongful conviction cases. The Colorado Innocence Project offered her a position, which she accepted with the understanding that she would also maintain a small private practice for clients who couldn't afford their services elsewhere. On the first anniversary of David's release, Sarah organized a small celebration at her apartment. Emma and Jake came, along with Tom and his new family. Patricia Valdez drove up from Denver, bringing her husband and teenage daughter. Timothy Ross was there, having left his job at the evidence warehouse to work for a private investigation firm that specialized in cold cases. As they sat around Sarah's dining room table, sharing stories and memories, Sarah looked at the faces of the people who had helped make David's freedom possible. Each of them had risked something: their careers, their safety, their comfortable assumptions about how the world worked. To help correct an injustice, David stood up halfway through dinner, his hands shaking slightly as he raised his glass of water. "I want to say something," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. 14 years ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I would die in that place, forgotten by everyone except Sarah." He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. "You didn't just give me back my freedom. You gave me back my faith in people, in the possibility that good can triumph over evil if enough people are willing to fight for it." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks, thinking of all the nights she had sat at this same table, surrounded by law books and case files, wondering if she was destroying her family for an impossible dream. The cost had been enormous. Her marriage, years of her children's lives, her own youth and health and peace of mind. But looking at David now, seeing him smile and laugh and plan for a future that stretched beyond the walls of a prison cell, Sarah knew she would make the same choices again. Family meant fighting for each other, even when the odds seemed impossible, even when the price seemed too high to pay. As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, David helped Sarah clean up the dishes. They worked in comfortable silence, brother and sister, survivors of a journey that had tested both of them beyond their limits. "What happens now?" David asked as they finished putting away the last of the plates. Sarah considered the question. Her law practice was growing, fueled by referrals from other attorneys who had watched her fight for David and wanted that same tenacity on their client's behalf. Emma was talking about moving back to Boulder, perhaps ready to rebuild their relationship now that Sarah's obsession with David's case was no longer consuming every moment of her life. Jake would graduate college soon and was considering law school himself. Inspired by his mother's example, "Now we live," Sarah said simply. "We live the lives we were meant to have, the ones that were stolen from us for 14 years. We find ways to help other people who are fighting battles they can't win alone. And we remember that justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we make happen. One case at a time, one person at a time." David nodded, understanding. He had learned in prison that survival meant taking each day as it came, finding small victories in the midst of overwhelming darkness. Freedom would require the same approach, not trying to reclaim all the lost years at once, but building a new life one day at a time. Outside, Boulder was settling into another quiet evening, families finishing dinner and children doing homework, and the ordinary rhythms of life continuing as they always had. But in Sarah's small apartment, brother and sister stood together in the aftermath of an extraordinary victory, proof that sometimes the system could be forced to admit its mistakes. Sometimes the innocent could be freed from their cages. Sometimes justice could triumph over corruption and indifference. It had taken 14 years, cost everything Sarah had valued about her old life, and required a kind of faith that bordered on madness. But David Mitchell was free, and that made all the sacrifice worthwhile. The conviction that had defined both their lives for so long was finally, truly over. Epilogue. 5 years later, Sarah Mitchell stood before the Colorado Bar Association to receive their award for public service. Recognizing her work with the Innocence Project and her successful efforts to free 3 more wrongfully convicted individuals, David was in the audience, along with Emma, Jake, and Tom's family. Patricia Valdez had flown in from Denver, where she now worked as a victim's advocate, helping other families navigate the criminal justice system. In her acceptance speech, Sarah spoke about the importance of never giving up on family, about the power of ordinary people to fight extraordinary injustices, about the difference one person can make when they refuse to accept that the system cannot be changed. "Justice is not a building or an institution," she said, looking out at the audience of lawyers and judges and law students. "Justice is a promise we make to each other, that we will not let the innocent suffer for crimes they did not commit, that we will not let corruption triumph over truth, that we will never stop fighting for what is right, no matter how long it takes or what it costs us." After the ceremony, as they walked out into the Colorado sunshine, David put his arm around his sister's shoulders. "You kept your promise," he said quietly. Sarah smiled, thinking of all the promises still to be kept, all the innocent people still waiting for someone to believe in them strongly enough to risk everything for their freedom. "We both did," she replied. "We both did."